Hello, everybody. My name is Perez, and today I will be presenting on the environmental exposures and their epigenetic effects on Alzheimer's disease. That is what my project was centered on in my research. Uh, I found Alzheimer's disease an interesting disease to study because there's so much we have not researched, and especially environmental exposures that we are prone to experience in our everyday life that may lead to the onset of this disease. So, as I move on, I will announce the slide that I am moving on to next. That way, you can follow along. So, the objectives of this presentation is to introduce you to my research project, to also present my thesis on the project. Alzheimer's disease prevalence in modern day society will also be reviewed. Genetic markers associated with Alzheimer's disease, um, such as the polyprotein E expression by the APO gene, will be reviewed in terms of its link to cholesterol membrane proteins in neurons. Uh, Epigenetic mechanisms related to the onset of Alzheimer's disease, such as amyloid beta accumulation, and its connection to environmental exposures from resulting oxidative stress, will be reviewed, and these NFT tangles in neurons that um, wrap around axons that affect communication in our prefrontal cortex are also going to be reviewed. We're going to go over environmental exposures that play a part in the incidence of Alzheimer's. At the end of this all, we're going to do a summary and future outlook on preventative methods of treatment. So moving on to slide 3, we see that Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder and the most common form of dementia. It causes gradual cognitive decline and impairment of mental faculties vital to everyday life. The most important of these factors are heightened risk of having um, Alzheimer's are age, family history, and hereditary genes or genetic inheritance of the disease. However, the genetic mechanisms that inhibit the onset of Alzheimer's have shown that epigenetics play a role in possible preventable exposures to the environment that we can avoid. So, when we talk about epigenetics, we're talking about genes that are influenced by environmental stressors, environmental interactions, different things that we experience or we can experience, which may be preventable, depending on how we reduce the risk of what the risk assessment of our environmental interactions. So researchers are now trying to make more of a concerted effort into this area to environmental exposures and to the deleterious effects of different environmental agents. And we will go into that in this presentation. So moving on to slide 4, we see that Alzheimer's disease is known to be hereditary and associated with older age. However, complex environmental exposure to factors such as oxidative stress, a high cholesterol diet, neurotoxic elements, and biological agents all play an essential role in the onset of the disease. So this is part of my thesis here. Um, what I wanted to research was how so much is being devoted into studying and trying to understand epigenetics and environmental agents that play or influence possible genetic pathways that can prevent or can progress Alzheimer's disease onset. Environmental factors shown to increase Alzheimer's are largely disregarded in comparison to education level, cognitive levels, and familial history of the disease, even though our environment influences most cases of AD. So there's a statistic that 75% of environmental exposures, or 75% of Alzheimer's diseases are due to environmental exposures and genetic interactions. So knowing this, wouldn't it make more sense for us to place more research into that area or try to understand that? And right now we do not really have a lot of research in that department. So moving on to slide 5, you see that we are going into a increasing prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in our modern day society. Um, it's the CDC projects a nearly threefold increase by the year 2050, from 2013's population of 5 million Americans to 14 million Americans with Alzheimer's. So this isn't going anywhere, ladies and gentlemen. This is only increasing, and it's increasing at a rapid pace. You see it in like death rates for heart disease and cancer, which are fortunate that we're reducing those. We are putting in the time and the effort and studies. What we aren't focusing on and what we need to focus more on is Alzheimer's, because it's just continuously increasing, and it's an unfortunate way for many human beings to perish. Losing one's mind is not not a very good way to die. I mean, honestly, we depend on our mind for many things, and it's very important to try to combat this disease. The estimated cost of dealing with Alzheimer's, in terms of if we do not do research, if we just continue on our current path of treating it, it's expected to rise up to $500 billion, and that's taking into account treatment, having to deal with these people who lose their cognitive functions and lose basic motor functions. They kind of revert back to when you were a child, and they don't know. And many of them are scared, and many of them are abused in elderly homes. And people, they don't understand that their minds are not there, and they would like them to be, but this disease has that factor. It takes away your mind, and it's not very fortunate for those who have it. So the fact that 75% of these cases are genetic and environmental interactions in review, that means that it's highly preventable. So we should put more of our eggs in a basket to try to prevent this. So moving on to slide 6. There are genetic markers associated with late onset AD. So that's the most common form of Alzheimer's disease. Primarily beta amyloid plaques and intraneuronal neural fibrillary tangles. So beta amyloid plaques are a protein that's formed outside of our brain and in certain cells. It's part of the membrane of the cells, and these proteins get cut off by these enzymes called secretases. We'll go over that in the future of this presentation, but you see that when they get cut off, they're carried across the blood-brain barrier, and they end up forming these plaques, kind of like, think of tumors, how it stops proper circulation in the cardiovascular system, or clots. They're like clots in the brain system for our communication, for our axons. So there's 3 slightly different allele versions of the APOE gene, which is being studied and normally a marker for diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. The E3, E4 allele genotype is the most prone to overexpressing a protein called apolipoprotein E. This is a protein which deals with cholesterol, and high fat diets have been shown to lead to higher rates of Alzheimer's disease. So as you can see in this diagram on slide 7, the study posted by JAMA Neurology showed that 74 patients sample with high LDL levels, that's bad cholesterol, showed higher chance of AD onset. So also in the same study, high levels of HDL, which is the good cholesterol, reduced AD onset. So that's an environmental factor in terms of our diet, what we bring into our bodies that affects Alzheimer's disease prevalence. Another possible factor is oxidative stress is linked to Alzheimer's. So reactive oxygen species, ROS, are free radicals that are byproducts of oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondrial cells. So as a result of stress, many times our mitochondria of our cells are over utilizing the energy component needed to keep our cells functioning. We have byproducts in the cellular world just like our own world, and sometimes we don't see this or we don't think about it, but that's why we have antioxidants. My issue is we see antioxidant commercials largely based for cancer, but nobody gives regard to Alzheimer's disease, and it's been shown that ROS is extremely dangerous because these radicals deteriorate our cellular components and they kill off our cells. Now, There's many environmental exposures in Alzheimer's, but primarily these five can be seen: toxic metals, industrial chemicals, air pollutants, pesticides, insecticides, antimicrobials, etc. So, exposures to neurotoxic metals, metals such as aluminum have shown increase phosphorylation of tau proteins in NFT structures. So, tau proteins are those proteins that are dealing with the neurofibrillary tangles. These tangles wrap around our axons and they inhibit communication between neurons, which then that leads to improper functioning of our cognitive processes. So that leads to Alzheimer's disease prevalence. Metals such as zinc, copper, and iron have also been shown as components of beta amyloid plaque formation. We have copper in our society, and aerial concentrations of that metal is increasing due to fossil fuel combustion. Lead was recently in our gasoline, and we're starting to see the effects of that now in our older population. Exposure to neurotoxic chemicals, organic phosphates used in agricultural pesticides. In one study, 3,024 individuals were studied and investigated based on occupational hazards they may have faced. So many of these people dealt with pesticides in their life. And amazingly, of the 572 individuals who had dealt with pesticides, even with their higher education and higher chance of not even having the E4 allele, they still were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, largely because of the chemicals and the pesticides. So finally, another exposure that is detrimental is neurotoxic drugs. So the continued prescription of anticholinergic effects, anticholinergic drugs such as Benadryl, Nitol, drugs that battle insomnia, which are normally given to elderly people, have shown high increases in Alzheimer's disease rates dealing with these drugs. So it's very important to try to deal or give these elders different alternatives. Finally, biological agents such as viruses, Epstein-Barr virus, and peripheral leukocyte cell DNA, herpes, human virus 6 have all shown higher rates of Alzheimer's disease because these diseases are influenced by our neurons and they affect the neuronal system. Sorry about that. Finally, pollutants that we see in our everyday environment, such as dioxins, TCDD, are responsible and also leading to the onset of Alzheimer's disease. As you move on to slide 15, environmental pollutants linked to Alzheimer's, TCDD in the study showed high phosphorylation of the tau protein, which again deals with NFT and its entanglement along our axons, and that affects our communication. So, in summary, presently there's no cure or prevention to guarantee a person of not having Alzheimer's, but there needs to be more research and more money devoted to the environmental exposures that I've gone through that lead to Alzheimer prevalence and progression. I wish I had more time to explain to you many more different exposures, but right now I want you guys to leave with the fact that we need to focus more on risk assessment of a person's past, current, and future environment, their health, of different factors. Everything we deal with in our environment needs to be profiled and cataloged, and public health officials should try to educate and help elderly people and us ourselves to try to avoid risky behavior that will lead to Alzheimer's. Future medicines are going to try to focus on beta amyloid plaque proteins, trying to stop the precursor APP from crossing that blood-brain barrier. So they're trying to get those enzymes in that process, secretase enzymes, beta and gamma. They're trying to stop their function. Also, the tau protein, it folds and wraps around their axons. They're starting to do medicines that try to prevent it from folding and doing that. And finally, on slide 18, the future of Alzheimer's. The future of Alzheimer's, my last sentence, is that it's going to focus more on preventative medicine and not so much on one cure. If we're going to curtail this, we need money to go in now and not in the future, and that's the only way we're going to stop environmental onset of Alzheimer's disease. Thank you, and